The Twins. A story confided to a prison chaplain by a condemned man. Rampo, Edogawa. Sir, today I have finally resolved to speak. My execution draws ever nearer. I wish to unburden my heart as soon as possible, so that I may at least spend my remaining days in peace. It will trouble you, I know, but I beg you to spare a little time for this wretched soul on death row. As you are aware, I was sentenced to death for killing a man and stealing 30,000 yen from his safe. No one suspects me of any crime beyond that. Indeed, it is true that I am guilty of exactly that much, and now that the ultimate penalty has been pronounced, there is no need whatsoever for me to confess to another, far graver crime. Even if it were a sin many times heavier than the one already known, there is no punishment beyond death for a man already condemned. And not only is there no need, there is also, even in one about to die, a certain vanity, a wish to leave behind as little infamy as possible. Besides, in this one matter, I have a reason I can never allow my wife to know. Because of that, I have endured needless suffering, though I knew full well that concealing it would not save me from execution. I kept that single truth buried deep, suppressing it whenever it rose to my lips during the court's relentless questioning. Yet now, I find myself wishing for you to tell my wife in full detail of that other crime. Perhaps even the worst of men turn back toward goodness when death draws near. To die without confessing, it would feel too cruel to my wife. And there is another reason I am terrified, beyond words, of the spirit of the man I killed. No, not the man I slew in the course of stealing the money. That crime is already confessed, and it troubles me little. But before that, I had committed yet another murder, and it is the thought of that man that haunts me without mercy. That man was my brother, but not a brother in the ordinary sense. I was born one of a pair of twins, and the man I killed, though called my elder brother, was my twin, the other half born alongside me from our mother's womb. He comes to torment me by day and by night. In my dreams, he crushes my chest with a weight of 1,000 caddies, his hands closing about my throat. In the daytime, he appears on that wall, glaring at me with an indescribable gaze, or leans from that window to cast upon me a loathsome, mocking smile. Worst of all is that, as my twin, he was identical to me in face and form, not a hair's breadth different. From the very day after I killed him, yes, before I was even brought here, he began to appear before me. When I think on it now, I suspect that it was his relentless vengeance that drove me to commit the second murder, and that brought about the discovery of that carefully planned crime. Perhaps all of it was the work of his undying malice. From the day after I killed him, I began to fear mirrors. Not only mirrors, anything that could reflect an image filled me with dread. I removed every mirror, every pane of glass, from my home. But what use was that? In the city, shop windows line the streets, each with a mirror gleaming at the back. The more I tried not to look, the more my eyes were drawn to them. And in those panes of glass and mirrors, the man I had killed, though in truth it was only my own reflection, would glare back at me with that hateful gaze. Once, passing a mirror shop, I nearly collapsed on the spot. There, countless identical men, the man I had murdered, focused 1,000 eyes upon me. And yet, though tormented by such visions, I did not yield. My arrogant confidence that a crime conceived with such cold clarity could never be discovered made me bold. The relentless busyness of adding crime upon crime, with never a second's lapse in vigilance, left no room in my mind for anything else. But once I was caught, it was all over. His ghost seized upon the monotonous prison life, devoid of distraction, and took full possession of my mind. Since my sentence was fixed as death, the torment has only grown worse. There are no mirrors here, yet when I wash or bathe, he appears upon the water's surface, taking the form of my own reflection. Even in the broth of my miso soup, his haggard face emerges. On the surfaces of dishes, on the shine of metal fittings, wherever an image can be reflected, there he is, looming large or small. Even in the shadow my own body casts, lit by the faint sunlight streaming through the window, I find him threatening me. And at last, what can I say? I began to fear the sight of my own body. This body of mine, identical in every wrinkle and fold to that of the man I killed, became a thing of horror to me. Better to die than to endure such suffering. The death penalty itself does not frighten me in the least. Indeed, I almost wish the day would come sooner. But I cannot go to my death in silence. I must have his forgiveness before I die, or rather, I wish to free myself from this inner terror that forces me to fear his phantom. There is only one way to do so, to confess my crime to my wife, and at the same time to let the world know it. Sir, I beg you listen to the confession I am about to make, and convey it to the judges. And, if I may make so bold, could you promise me that you will also tell my wife? Ah, thank you for agreeing. Then, I shall now tell you of my other crime. As I have already said, I was born as one half of an exceedingly rare pair of twins, apart from a single mole on my thigh, which our parents used as the only means of telling us apart. We were identical in every respect, as though cast from the same mold, from the crown of our heads to the tips of our toes. Had someone counted the hairs on our heads, they might have found not a single one more or less between us. It was being born into such perfect likeness that lay at the root of my great crime. One day, I resolved to kill my brother, my twin. Not that I bore him any deep or burning hatred. True, I felt a bitter resentment that, while he inherited the family estate and a vast fortune as the sole heir, my share was but a pittance in comparison, and I could not forget that the woman who had once been my sweetheart was, solely because my brother's wealth and position outweighed mine, compelled by her parents to become his wife. Yet these were not, strictly speaking, my brother's sins, but those of the parents who had placed him in such a position. If I were to bear a grudge, it should have been against them, though they were already dead. As for my brother, he seemed entirely unaware that his wife had once been the object of my love. Had I lived my life steadily, perhaps nothing would ever have happened. But, alas, whether by nature or fate, I was born a villain and was woefully inept at the ordinary business of getting on in the world. Worse still, I lacked any goal in life. I was the sort of wastrel who thought only of enjoying each day's pleasures as they came, caring nothing for the uncertainties of tomorrow, whether I might be alive or dead. Failing in both fortune and love, I had grown reckless and self-destructive. Even the small inheritance I had received vanished in no time. Thus, I had no choice but to trouble my brother for money. I caused him no small amount of inconvenience, and as my requests multiplied without end, he grew weary of my demands. At last, no matter how I pleaded, he told me outright that he would never help me again until I mended my ways, and he even turned me away at the door. One day, after being refused yet again, I was walking home from his house when a dreadful thought struck me. The instant it rose in my mind, I shuddered. I tried to shake off the horrible fancy, but as I turned it over and over, I began to see that it was not altogether impossible. With the utmost resolve and careful attention, I might carry it out without the slightest risk, and in doing so, gain both wealth and the woman I had lost. For several days I thought of nothing else. After weighing every possible circumstance, I at last determined to put the fearful plan into action. It was not hatred for my brother that drove me. Born a villain, I desired nothing more than my own pleasure, no matter what sacrifice it might require. But though a villain, I was also a terrible coward. Had I foreseen the least danger, I would never have dared such a resolve. The scheme I devised, however, seemed to me entirely without peril, or so I believed. And so, I set my plan in motion. As a preliminary step, I began visiting my brother's house frequently, but without drawing undue attention. I studied in minute detail the daily habits of my brother and his wife, leaving nothing unobserved, not even so trivial a matter as whether my brother twisted a towel to the right or to the left when wringing it dry. After more than a month of painstaking study, when my observations were at last complete, I devised a pretext that would arouse no suspicion. I told my brother that I was going to Korea to work. I should explain that at that time I was still unmarried, so such a plan seemed perfectly natural. My brother, delighted at what appeared to be a serious resolution, may, if one were to think ill of him, have simply been glad to be rid of a burden. In any case, he gave me a rather generous parting gift. One day, chosen carefully as the day most suited to every detail of my plan, I boarded a southbound train from Tokyo Station, my brother and his wife seeing me off. When the train reached Yamakita Station, I was supposed to remain aboard all the way to Shimonoseki. Instead, without drawing attention, I got off, waited a short while, then slipped into the third-class car of an upbound train and returned to Tokyo. While waiting at Yamakita, I entered the station lavatory and, with the point of a knife, cut away the mole on my thigh, the sole mark by which my brother and I could be told apart. With that gone, we were utterly indistinguishable. And as for my brother acquiring an identical scar in that exact spot, well, such a coincidence was hardly impossible. I arrived back at Tokyo Station just before dawn, exactly as I had planned in advance. I was dressed in a casual Oshima kimono, identical to the one my brother wore. Every day at that time, of course. I had prepared the same underclothes, sash, and wooden clogs as his as well. Choosing my moment carefully, I went to my brother's house. Taking care to be seen by no one, I climbed over the rear wooden fence and crept into the wide garden. It was still dim in the early morning, and I had no fear of being discovered by the household. I made my way to the side of an old well in one corner of the garden. This old well had been one of the decisive factors in my resolve to commit the crime. Long since dried up and useless, my brother had decided it should be filled in, saying that such a pit in the garden was dangerous. A mound of earth for the task had already been piled nearby, awaiting only a moment when the gardener was free to begin the work. 2 or 3 days earlier, I had gone to the gardener myself and ordered him to start that very morning, the morning I intended to slip into the grounds. I crouched in the thicket of shrubs, waiting. I knew my brother's habit. Every morning after washing his face, he would stroll through the garden, breathing deeply. I waited for him to approach, my whole being in a fever. My body trembled ceaselessly, like one seized by ague. I felt a cold dampness trickle from my armpits down my arms. That unbearable, waiting how long it seemed. It felt to me as if 3 hours had passed before, at last, The sound of wooden clogs echoed from afar. Many times in those moments I nearly fled, but the shred of reason left in me kept me rooted to the spot until he appeared before me. At last, the long-awaited victim came right up to the thicket where I lay hidden. I sprang out and, from behind, looped the prepared cord around the neck of my brother, my twin, identical to me in every detail, and tightened it with all the desperation of a man fighting for his life. Even as I strangled him, my brother tried to twist his head back to see who his attacker was. I threw all my strength into preventing him, yet his head, as though powered by some powerful spring, slowly, inexorably turned toward me. At last, his swollen, crimson face, no different from my own, turned halfway toward me, and with the whites of his eyes showing, he caught sight of my face. For an instant, an expression of shocked recognition flashed across his features. That look I shall never forget as long as I live. But almost at once, he ceased to struggle, and his body went limp. My hands had stiffened into the posture of strangulation, and it took considerable effort to force them open again. Then, steadying my trembling legs, I rolled my brother's body over to the old well nearby and pushed it down into the depths. Picking up a piece of board lying about, I scraped the mound of earth piled at the side into the well until the corpse was completely covered. Had there been a bystander, it must have seemed a strange, nightmare-like scene in broad daylight. A man silently strangling, another man dressed exactly like him, with the same build, the same face, without a word from start to finish. Yes, so it was that I committed the great crime of fratricide. You were no doubt astonished that I could kill my one and only brother without a shred of remorse. And you are right to be. But I tell you, it was precisely because he was my brother that I was able to kill him. Perhaps you have experienced it yourself. There exists in human beings a feeling of hatred for one's own kin. It is often written of in novels, so I am surely not alone in having felt it a hatred far more unbearable than any directed toward a stranger. And in the case of twins whose faces are identical, such hatred can become almost unendurable. Even without any other reason, the mere fact that he was a blood relative with the same face was enough to make me want to kill him. I believe that even a coward like myself was able to kill so calmly because I carried this peculiar hatred within me. Once I had covered the body with earth, I remained crouching there. After about 30 minutes, a maid arrived, leading the gardener. I turned, stepping onto the stage for the first time in my new role as my brother, with a slight tremor of nerves, and said as naturally as I could, "Ah, master, you're early. I was just lending you a hand here. Haha, you'll be able to finish filling it today, won't you? Well then, I leave it in your hands." With that, I rose slowly and walked toward the house in my brother's gate. From that point, everything proceeded smoothly. All that day, I shut myself in my brother's study, carefully examining his diary and account books. The only two items I had not had time to study before announcing my supposed trip to Korea. That evening, I dined with my wife, who until yesterday had been my brother's wife, chatting cheerfully, in the same manner as my brother, with no fear of discovery. And later that night, I went so far as to enter her bedchamber. I will admit I sensed some danger in doing so, for I knew nothing of my brother's habits in that most intimate of settings. But I had one conviction. Even if she did somehow discover the truth, she would never expose me, her former lover, to the law. So, without hesitation, I slid open the paper door of her room, and by extraordinary fortune, she suspected nothing, and thus I committed even the crime of adultery. For a full year thereafter, I lived in perfect happiness. I had more money than I could spend, and I possessed the woman I had once loved. Even my insatiable greed found no cause for complaint during that year, though, as I have already told you. I was constantly tormented by my brother's ghost. But a year was the utmost limit for a man, as easily bored as I am. Around that time, I began to tire of my wife. Then, my old habits reasserted themselves. I began to stray. I sought out every possible form of extravagance, spending money like water. No fortune could withstand it. In no time my debts were mounting steeply. At last, when there was no longer any source from which to draw the funds I required, I began to commit my second crime. This second crime was, in nature, something that followed almost inevitably from the first. Indeed, when I first resolved to kill my brother, I had already thought of it in this way. If I could completely and perfectly become my brother, then no matter what heinous acts the former me had committed, they could have no effect on me now that I was my brother. In other words, if the younger brother, who had departed for Korea and vanished without a trace, were to return to Japan and commit murder or robbery, those would all be the crimes of the younger brother. As long as he was not captured, there could be no danger whatsoever to me, the elder brother. Not long after I committed my first crime, I made a discovery that startled me greatly, and this discovery made the possibility of the second crime all the clearer. One day, I was carefully imitating my brother's handwriting as I wrote the day's entry in his diary, one of the tedious daily duties I had to perform now that I was living as him. After finishing, I did as I usually did, comparing here and there between the parts written by me and those written by my real brother. Then something caught my eye, something astonishing. In the corner of one page, written by my real brother, there was a clear fingerprint. I was startled to realize what a terrible oversight I had made. I had believed that the mole on my thigh was the only difference between us, but I was gravely mistaken. I had once heard that fingerprints are unique to each individual, that even identical twins can never have the same prints. And so, upon discovering this unmistakable fingerprint of my brother in his diary, I turned pale with fear that the mask I wore might be stripped away through that single clue. I quietly bought a magnifying glass and compared, in the minutest detail, the fingerprint in the diary with impressions of my own made on a separate sheet. At first glance, one of my prints looked almost identical to it, but when I traced ridge by ridge, they were unmistakably different. Curiously enough, the overall effect was nearly the same, while the parts, examined closely, were quite unlike. For certainty's sake, I contrived to take the fingerprints of my wife and the maid's as well. These, without even close comparison, bore no resemblance. There was nothing for it but to conclude that the print belonged to my brother. That it resembled mine was only natural. We were too perfectly alike, as twins, yet even so, fingerprints, however slightly, are fingerprints, and they differ. Alarmed at the thought that there might be many more such traces, I searched everywhere I could, leafing through the pages of his vast library, one volume at a time, probing the dust in the backs of closets and cupboards, investigating every place where prints might linger. Nowhere did I find another only that page in the diary. Somewhat relieved, I thought that if I reduced that leaf alone to ashes, I would have nothing to fear. I tore it out and was about to drop it into the brazier when, at that very instant, there flashed upon me an inspiration. Not a divine one, I should say, but doubtless the devil's. What if I took a mold of that fingerprint, and, should the occasion arise to commit my second crime, left at the scene a print made from that mold? The devil whispered thus in my ear. Suppose, to take an extreme case, that I myself were to kill a man. First, I would imagine that the younger brother, who had gone to Korea, had slipped back into the country. In spirit and in appearance, I would make myself the picture of a down-at-heel younger brother. At the same time, I would prepare, as the elder brother, an alibi. Then I would commit the murder, taking every precaution to leave no evidence. Even this alone might suffice, but should suspicion, by some mischance, fall upon me as the elder brother, I would be in danger. An alibi, however carefully arranged, cannot be guaranteed never to collapse. But if, in that event, a fingerprint of the real elder brother were found at the scene, what then? No one would have any record of the prints I bore back when I was still the younger brother, and there would be no way to know whose they were. Even if someone had witnessed my deed, the mere discrepancy in fingerprints would clear me. The police would be forced to hunt forever for a man who bore the fingerprints of one already dead, and for me as the younger brother, who, apart from myself now living as the elder, ought no longer to exist in this world. I was beside myself with delight at this splendid idea. It would be to enact in reality that dreamlike tale, Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Villain that I am, I doubt I ever felt such happiness, before or since, as when I hit upon this contrivance. At the time I conceived it, however, I was still steeped in a life of contentment and had no thought of plotting evil. I first put it to the test only after I began my dissipations, and my debts grew pressing. On one occasion, I used this method to steal a tidy sum from a friend's house. Making the fingerprint into a rubber stamp was no great task for me. I had some experience in plate making, so from that time on, whenever I was in want of money for my pleasures, I employed this trick. Not once did I fall under the slightest suspicion. In some cases, the victim resigned himself and never reported the matter to the police. In others, even if it did become a police matter, it was quietly dropped before they ever got as far as checking for fingerprints. Theft became so absurdly easy, so devoid of challenge, that I grew bolder and bolder, until at last I committed murder. As for this final crime of mine, you will no doubt find it in the official records, so I shall recount it briefly. I was, as usual, hard-pressed for a considerable sum due to my mounting debts, when I happened to hear from the man himself, as we stood together before his safe, that an acquaintance of mine would, for certain reasons, something, I believe, to do with political funds, have to keep the large sum of 30,000 yen in that safe overnight. I was trusted enough, despite my debts, to be present at such a conversation. In the room, besides the master of the house and myself, were his wife and 2 or 3 other guests. Having carefully gathered every detail I needed, I slipped into his house that night, disguised as the younger brother. Of course, I had already prepared my alibi as the elder brother. I had no difficulty in making my way to the room with the safe. Wearing gloves, I opened it. It was, after all, the safe of a long-time friend, and learning the combination had been a simple matter, and I took out the bundles of cash. At that moment, the light in the room, which had been off, suddenly flashed on. Startled, I turned to find the owner of the safe standing there, glaring at me. In that instant, I knew it was the end. Without thinking, I drew the small knife from my breast and hurled myself at him, plunging the blade into his chest. It was all over in a moment. He lay dead at my feet. I listened intently. Fortunately, no one stirred. Or perhaps, even if they knew, they were frozen with fear. Quickly, I pressed the Rubbermaid fingerprint dipped in the blood that had pooled nearby firmly onto the wall, making sure to leave no other trace. Then, taking care not to leave footprints, I fled in haste. The next day, a detective came to call. Confident as I was, I felt no alarm. In most apologetic tones, he explained that they were visiting each person who might have known of the large sum in the safe and that a single fingerprint had been found at the scene. One that did not match any in the criminal records. Therefore, as I was a friend of the deceased and one of those aware of the money, he would, if I did not mind, like to take my prints. While inwardly laughing at them, I outwardly adopted the air of a man grieving his friend's death, asking questions in a sympathetic tone, and allowed them to take my fingerprints. Detective, I suppose by now you must be running yourselves ragged, searching for the owner of a fingerprint you could never trace in a lifetime. With an unexpected fortune now in my possession, I thought no more about the matter, and at once ordered a carriage to take me to my usual haunts of pleasure. 2 or 3 days later, the same detective called again, though I only learned afterward that he was among the most renowned investigators of the Metropolitan Police. I went into the reception room without a care, but when I caught a faint smile at the corner of his mouth, a sound like a strangled cry burst from my throat. Calmly, the detective placed a slip of paper on the table. In my agitation, I did not fully grasp it at the time, but afterward I realized it had been my warrant of arrest. While I glanced at the paper, he moved swiftly to bind my hands with cord. At the entrance stood a burly constable. There was nothing I could do, and so I was taken into custody. Even then, fool that I was, I still felt secure, certain there could be no conceivable evidence to prove I was the murderer. But imagine my astonishment when I was brought before the examining magistrate and heard the charges against me. My mouth fell open in sheer disbelief. Indeed, it was so absurd a mistake that even I, the culprit, could not help but give a strange laugh. It had been, without doubt, a dreadful oversight on my part. But who had caused me to make such an error? I am convinced it was the dreadful curse of my brother. From the very first instant, he must have known, and in silence he watched, from a mere trifling misunderstanding, until it ripened into the appalling revelation of my crime. And what a laughably simple blunder it was. The fingerprint I had been so certain was my brother's was, in fact, my own. The print in that diary had not been a true, clean impression. It had been left after an ink-stained finger had been wiped on something, and then pressed down. The result was that the ink clung in the furrows between the ridges, like a photographic negative. I could hardly believe my own stupidity. Yet, when I heard the full explanation, I realized my mistake was not entirely unreasonable. During my examination, the magistrate happened to mention a case from 1913 in Fukuoka. The wife of a German officer, then held as a prisoner of war, had been brutally murdered. When the police arrested the suspect, they found that the fingerprint from the crime scene resembled, but did not exactly match, his own. This puzzled them greatly, until they sought the opinion of a certain medical doctor. After much study, the doctor discovered that the print from the scene was a negative. By taking enlarged photographs of both prints and inverting the colors, turning the black lines white and the white lines black, he found the two matched perfectly. And there, I have told you everything I wish to say. I am sorry to have taken up so much of your time with such a dreary tale. Please, as you promised, tell all of this to the judges and to my wife. I will mount the scaffold comforted by the certainty that you will keep your word. I beg you grant this dying wish of a pitiful man condemned to death.